I had felt it. Far off. Similar to a pre-storm migraine for months. Like some force in the world had plans for us we didn't know about, but could see forming. The pregnancy had been rocky from the start, not to mention how many IVF treatments it took. It felt like both our lives had been on some rickety train track, somehow still clinging to the edges. Neither one of us were ready, and we both knew it. It was like a third person was already in the room, constantly waiting to be introduced so they could talk some sense into us. Jules was getting worked to the bone at the hospital over the past year, understaffed and underpaid. She took time off as soon as she could when the pregnancy was confirmed. She told me she had similar feelings as I did. Like something was coming. And not just a baby. She kept saying she just wanted me home, on the couch beside her at night, my hands on hers as she massaged her growing belly. That was all she needed for comfort. I was a beat cop and dragged my feet on asking for the time off. So, fate stepped in and ushered me along in a way I couldn't imagine. It was a Friday, and I was going to talk to the staff sergeant at the end of the shift. But I received a call to the local junior high school. There was a shooting in progress. 2 active shooters with small explosives. I pulled into the parking lot of the school and saw smoke billowing from windows and fire lashing out from within. I rushed to the back doors of the school, but found them chain locked from the inside. I could see there was a thick padlock keeping it shut. Gunfire, screams and small explosions rang out from inside. Smoke was creeping out from under the doors. I radioed back. They said tactical was 4 minutes away. Another officer, O'Reilly, was a minute out though, and to wait on him before breaching. We wouldn't be able to help the kids inside the door anyway. The IARD training we did, immediate action, rapid deployment, was very clear that in high-risk situation, our only intent was to take out the shooter. Run fast and shoot straight. Early contact is key. It was a concept that came out in the wake of the Columbine shooting. First responders were no longer setting up a perimeter or even trying to help those wounded. Locating and neutralizing the shooter was our lone purpose. The crying on the other side of the door had turned to whimpering. The banging had stopped. I checked the time. A minute had passed. No sign of O'Reilly. He was probably stopping at green lights. He was the type of cop who actively avoided any call that required him getting out of his cruiser. Wherever he was, I bet he was monitoring the radio and wouldn't show up until after tactical arrived. The whimpering on the other side of the door went quiet. I couldn't wait any longer. I had already waited too long. I ran back to my cruiser and got my pack. Bolt cutters, pry bar, additional vest to protect from the high-power rifles. I speared the pry bar into the mesh window. The glass cubed away, but I had to tear through the thick metal netting. Smoke poured out, and all the sounds of the horrors inside came rushing up to meet me. I could barely see inside, but managed to find the padlock and snapped it with the bolt cutters. I yanked the door open, and 2 tiny bodies spilled out. They'd been the ones pressed against the door, whimpering. They were gone now. I wanted to go home. I wanted to shut the blinds to the world and disappear forever. It would be so easy to just turn back now, wait for tactical, since O'Reilly must have gotten lost. A scream peered out from inside and pulled me back to the doorway to hell. I could see more bodies, hazy through the smoke. I pulled my Glock and slid in through the door, finding destruction like I couldn't imagine. My senses were overwhelmed. The air reeked of cordite so heavily, I felt it coating my lungs. My ears were ringing from the gunfire and explosions overhead. The smoke detectors were screaming in short bursts, adding to the ringing. Some had been shut off in the ceiling, but still squeaked out, distorted alarm. And the walls, the ones I could see, looked like they had been painted red. Smoke hung in the air like a storm cloud. The hallway floor was lined with bodies. tiny backpacks strapped to them. What an AR-15 can do to a body, a kid's body, is indescribable. I walked towards the end of the hall, where a staircase led up. The gunfire and explosions were coming from the second floor, so that's where I was going. I made my way down the hall, ducking just below the smoke line and keeping my eyes trained away from the floor. I was 10 feet from the staircase when the war zone upstairs went quiet. Gunfire, explosions, screams, it all muted out. Only the occasional and distorted smoke detectors pierced the silence. I kept moving. A new sound startled me, causing me to nearly fire off my gun. It was a cell phone chime, muffled out from underneath one of the bodies. Then, another ringtone, and another, and another. A chorus of phone calls were coming into various cell phones. And all I could think was how sad I was for the parents who would never hear their children's voices pick up on the other end, ever again. My heart broke for them all. All the parents who dropped off their kids in the morning, not knowing they were saying goodbye. Then, I heard whistling, laughter, joking and talking. 2 voices, males. They were coming down the staircase. I took a knee to the left of the stairs and trained my clock on the stairway entrance. I was off to the side just enough they wouldn't see me until after I'd seen them. The laughing got closer, echoing down the halls. The whistling started again. He was reciting the tune of "Pop Goes the Weasel." My finger rested against the trigger. I was ready. The laughing and whistling harmonized together now to the same tune, echoing louder and closer. I trained my gun at hit level. No, chest level. 2 in the chest. Put the first one down, then the second. But what if there's a third? Footsteps hit the last row of stairs. 2 sets of footsteps. Only 2. My gun was hair-triggered on the entryway. Pop Goes the Weasel got louder, more disturbed. Two shadows appeared in the entrance. My finger hovered on the trigger, but didn't pull. Then, they appeared in the doorway. Both had been dressed in skeleton print suits and carried chest kits and ammo vests with additional handguns to accompany their modified ARs. They both appeared to be late teens, but I couldn't see their faces. The first one hand-painted on a clown face, with an exaggerated toothy grin up his cheeks. It was frightening as the rest of his face was smeared with red ink. The other kid had a Hannibal Lecter mask on. It was smeared with blood, which I couldn't tell was real or fake. They saw me as soon as I saw them, but all 3 of us froze. I had to drop on them, my Glock already leveled at my target. They smiled, dropped their guns, and held out their wrists to be handcuffed. "Arrest us! You'll be the hero," they said, tauntingly. I couldn't take them in. I didn't think about whether they had explosive charges on them that could have blown up not only us, but possibly even the entire school. I didn't think about how torturous prison would be for them for the rest of their lives if I brought them in. All I could think was how much I wanted them buried under the prison and erased from history. I put 2 in the smiling teen's chest and 2 in the Hannibal kid's chest. They both went down hard. I felt rage take over completely, and I unloaded the rest of the magazine between the 2. I peppered their faces. I didn't want them to have an open casket. I never wanted anyone to see those 2 again. I was put on leave as SIU came in to investigate. I was brought in multiple times, Interviews racked my days, and there was very nearly a criminal case against me by the parents of the shooters. They had a reasonable case against what I did. I just can't imagine having the nerve to bring it forward after what their children had done. I had been off work ever since, which had been the plan before, just not in this way. Nightmares haunted me. All of them were with the two boys. I was older in the dream, and somehow I knew I had a daughter in an upstairs classroom. But I couldn't get to her. The floors were wet cement, and I felt like my muscles had been stripped from my legs. The dream would always end with a chase to get to her, and I always lost. There were a few weeks where I was almost positive I was going to jail. The lawyer had called and told me prosecution was seeking 5 years for each of the kids in a massive lawsuit against the force. But in the last week, it all crumbled away. It turned out to be a pie-in-the-sky hope from the prosecution, and I was let off, but put on leave with mandatory weekly visits to a behavioral psychologist to start immediately. I figured that was a fair trade, even though I was feeling more and more like I didn't belong on the force. The investigation coming up clean was a gift and a lesson. I didn't belong there. What I was gonna do now? I had no idea. I had some time to decide, and with Jules pregnant, our hands would be full for a while. With us both home now, I'd seen changes in Jules as the pregnancy wore on. More and more, I'd find her in the baby's room, holding up tiny onesies over her belly, the little socks and beanie caps, looking through the picture books we would eventually entertain her with, getting used to the sway of the rocking chair. There was a basket filled with yarn and sewing needles Jules put together and had been learning over the last few weeks. She was embracing it all, despite the dark cloud we'd felt lingering. It was Friday, and we'd gone in for Jules' last checkup before delivery next week. I had been dreading it, thinking something would come up, something unavoidable or unfixable. But the baby was perfect. Our little girl was healthy and ready to be delivered on her due date. On our way home, I had noticed the Wakewood subway station was closed off. In fact, the whole street was. There were white vans and trucks and scientists in hazmat suits and a strong military presence. Normally, I wouldn't be nervous about something like this, but the station was a block away from our apartment building. And what was more strange, I didn't see any news station nearby. Not one reporting on anything. When we got home, I checked for any updates about Wakewood. Nothing from any major, medium or minor news networks. All I found were a few posts from anons on Twitter, which were shadow banned or quickly taken down. Just as my interest peaked, there was a knock on the window. Although we were 6 stories up, this was far from abnormal. Rick, our neighbor from the apartment next door, which was separated by a large piece of frosted glass. We joked that we were kind of like each other's Wilsons from Home Improvement. I joined him on the balcony and bumped the track from his sack over the partition. I was happy to see Rick and figured he'd have some wild idea about what was going on. He worked for the city, but thrived on conspiracy theories and had his fingers on the pulse. He was never less than interesting, and wasn't insulting or condescending. As it turned out, he had a huge scoop on what was happening. I tried to keep up, but he spoke fast, overwhelming me with information. Sometimes it felt like that was part of how he came across as persuasive. Every word and sentence marched out like a perfectly thorough and thought-out idea. He spoke well and found the right words to make you question what you previously believed. Rick claimed there was a viral leak down by the water in the industrial district. There are several large warehouses that contain some kind of secret government facilities. At one of the warehouses in a gain-of-function lab, a vicious strain of an experimental pathogen had gotten out. An infected lab worker left work, got on the subway, and made it 5 stops before getting off and banging on the tracks. The worker apparently started screaming and jumped over the edge as a new subway was coming into the station. They were trying to do contact tracing by using face identifying technology with the CCTV footage throughout the trains and platforms. I asked Rick how he knew this, and he said he had people working with the city that were feeding him details as they happened. Rick himself was an electrician and was constantly in and out of the subway systems. In fact, he told me he was sneaking in later. He had his own hazmat suit and clearance through the city, and if he got turned away, he said he'd creep through the sewers. He knew some secret routes through the city. And with that, Jules came out and the conversation turned towards the pregnancy and next week's birth. Rick said he bought our soon-to-be-born daughter a bottle of whiskey for her 18th birthday, so it'll age nicely by the time she opens it. Jules and Rick went on, but I kept thinking about what Rick said about Wakewood Station. It all seemed scary and true. He'd been persuasive again, and I felt anxiety creeping back in. During dinner, the speaker we were using to listen to Spotify turned off. I checked my cell, but found no bars. Jules checked hers, and it was the same. Our wireless router wasn't picking up any signals. I turned on the TV, and every channel had the same thing on. A bright yellow screen. It was a warning. The downtown core was on a strict and immediate lockdown. No one was to leave their homes under any circumstances. We were to leave the TV on for further instructions as they came. Jules and I were in disbelief. Her more than I. I was thinking back to the conversation with Rick, and how much more sane it was sounding. I wanted to see what he thought about all this. But when I banged on the wall we shared with him, I got nothing back. That meant Rick was there, in the subway systems, either discovering what was happening, or being discovered. I looked out the window and peered into the other apartment buildings. They were all filled with the yellow lights from the TV screen warnings. Everyone was staring helplessly at the same thing. This was real. We talked about going to our neighbors down the hall, or on the other floors to see if they heard anything. But we decided to stay inside for the night and watch a Blu-ray. We wanted to get our minds off of what was happening and towards the excitement of next week. But it was impossible. We went to bed early, but just laid there. We were spooning, and I knew she was awake too. Our hands were in their nightly spot, linked together on top of her pregnant belly. I could feel the baby moving around most nights. But tonight was interrupted by knocks at the window in the living room. It was Rick. He was back. I went out to meet him on the balcony. He was panicking, covered in sweat, like he'd just run a marathon, which seemed at least half right. He had gotten into the subway station, and he had learned things. As he started, I was noticing how sweaty he had gotten. He was coughing, his nose was runny. If whatever he was talking about was a virus, he looked to have the most common symptoms. I asked him to calm down and speak slowly. He took a breath and laid it out. Rick claimed he was wrong. Kind of, in that it wasn't biochemical medical labs in the warehouses. It was a series of testing facilities for advanced particle accelerators. A defense contractor had built a groundbreaking new hadron collider to test the limits of cosmic acceleration and dark matter. It started with the creation of microscopic quantum black holes. But they had been pushing the accelerator further, its reach far exceeding our known laws of nature, of reality. Something came out of one of the black holes before the accelerator was shut down. The CDC had been brought in quickly to contain and study. What they had discovered was something like a virus. At least, that's how they were referring to it. But it wasn't like anything anyone had ever heard of. It was both physiological and psychological. It was being referred to as Pandemia 115. It appeared that when you became infected, it starts with a migraine, chills, and fever. Then, the hallucinations start. You'll hear things first, see things, and it will keep pushing them on you. The virus comes in 3 waves of dose over the course of a 9-hour lifespan. It's operated by latching into our nervous systems and adrenal glands, feeding off our naturally occurring cortisol spikes during fear responses. The hyper-intelligent virus finds our most personal, fear-inducing thoughts and supercharges them, strengthening itself as we grow weaker. In the end, the virus burns the host out with a fever of 115. And what was worse, it had an 80% infection fatality rate. Rick went into a hacking coughing fit, which he then blamed on too many cigarettes. But it didn't look like that. It looked like his body was trying to fight off something, and was losing. I was getting more nervous. Whether or not the Hadron Collider thing was accurate or not, there was some kind of virus or bacteria that caused a massive citywide lockdown. And good or bad, Rick was our only current source of information. A spotlight hit our window from below, and yelling from a megaphone bellowed up from the street. Voices ordered us back inside, under threat of immediate arrest. I rushed in and right into Jules. She'd been there, at the doorway to the balcony, listening. We ducked down and shut the door. The spotlights turned off, and the eerie stillness of the quiet downtown returned. Jules and I whispered to each other. She told me she had heard most of what Rick said, and it all sounded crazy. I agreed. But something was happening. Footsteps and movement came from the stairs down the hall. I heard more orders being barked. Then, boards being put up against the doors, nail guns firing off. They were locking all of us in our apartments. I went to the door to confront them, yelling that there was a pregnant woman inside. But there was no response, and before I could open the door, it was bolted shut. They locked down our whole floor, then moved on to the next one. We listened as they went through our entire building. We looked out the windows, keeping far away enough from the edges, and saw large teams of scientists and military personnel in hazmats, carrying medical equipment, nail guns and bolting equipment, or semi-automatic rifles. They also had body bags. The side of our wall erupted in banging. It was Rick. It sounded like he was gonna come right through into our apartment. He started screaming, the most terrified, unsettling shrieks of absolute fear. I yelled to him, even banged back from our side. But Rick continued screaming and thudding his side of the wall. Then, the thudding stopped. The screaming continued, but it moved through Rick's apartment. A second later, we heard glass shattering. Then, a sick, horrifying thud on the pavement below. We rushed to the window and saw Rick's body splayed out on the pavement. Hazmat suits moved in with large hoses and sprayed a cement-like liquid which solidified in seconds after covering his body. A spotlight hit his window and ours again. We dropped back down, hiding below the frame. After a moment, the spotlight disappeared, and darkness resumed. We could hear workers below sterilizing and cleaning up the blood splatter from Rick's body. Jules was crying quietly, trying to hide it. Not that she needed to. I was shook and felt my stomach doing somersaults. We couldn't wrap our heads around how quickly our lives had changed since this morning. We decided to pull the shades in our bedroom and hope for a better tomorrow. But neither one of us could sleep. Our Wi-Fi was out, so we couldn't listen to Spotify or anything. We pulled out our phones and went through all the photos we had together. We had each taken pictures of mostly similar times and events. So it was fun to see and compare the ones we had decided to hold on to individually. It put us into a better mood, and we started to kiss. But it was interrupted by a cell phone ringtone. It was coming from the living room, and it wasn't one of our phones. I got up confused. Jules was even more puzzled. But at me, she couldn't hear anything. As I got to the bedroom door, another cell phone chimed out. It was the SpongeBob theme song. Then, another tune joined in. This one from a different kids show. I entered the living room as 4, 5, 6 new cell phones joined in. A chorus had begun, and they all hit the same harmony I'd heard before in the school hallway, filled with dead kids and their never-ending ringtones. On the floor of the living room were a pile of bloody cell phones, all ringing out with the screens displaying the words, "Call from Mom or Dad." Jules sided up next to me, worried. She didn't hear the cell phones or see them. Pain streaked to my brain, and I couldn't think as a migraine took control. I stumbled back onto the couch. Jules dropped down next to me, putting her hands on me to comfort. And that was when I realized I was freezing. And I mean dead of deep north winter freezing. A blanket was thrown over me quickly. Jules was trying to warm me up. And like a cloud of fog dissipating, the migraine loosened its hold. But it was replaced by something else. Whatever was out there infecting people, I had it. And the first wave was about to start. The fever rocked my body. I'd never felt so hot, like I was on fire inside and out. Jules got me into the shower and blasted the cold water. I laid in the tub, hyperventilating. As tears overwhelmed Jules, she put her face in her hands. This was all too much, for both of us. Then the sobbing and tears changed, almost imperceptibly, but it continued to shift, like a staccaty TV channel coming into reception. It wasn't crying anymore. It was laughter. Slowly, Jules started pulling her hands away from her face. It wasn't her face anymore. It was like a child, but old and twisted, broken and rearranged like a real-life Dr. Seuss character. Her lips pulled back into a giant smile, and her teeth began to elongate. No, they were falling out, being pushed out by larger, sharper teeth. Her lower jaw unhinged and extended down, revealing rows of other sharper teeth in a deep black chasm of a throat. The frightening child stood up, looking down at me in the tub. I wanted to get up and out, but I had trim legs, and nothing was working. I managed to grab the shower curtain just as the child jumped down on me and blocked her. I felt my legs get their strength back, and I flipped the body off me. I shot up and out of the bathroom. Footsteps followed me into the hall, and I ran into the bedroom. I slammed the door shut, but when I turned back, I wasn't in Jules and I's bedroom. I was in my childhood basement. The lone finicky light bulb overhead twitched on and off, just like it always used to. My eyes stayed away from the back corner of the basement, but I could just see something poking out of the shadows. The 2 silver protective bars that made up the cage at the front of a football helmet. My heart turned into a machine gun. The rest of me was paralyzed. The helmet. My dad's old high school football helmet. A fear that had long been forgotten suddenly overwhelmed me with a horrifying nostalgia. The helmet shifted. Something moved it. Something inside it. Then, buzzing. So faint at first, but it grew louder. The helmet vibrated with the sound. I heard the wings begin to hum. I knew what was in there and took off for the stairs up. I got halfway up before they began to elongate, stretching upward into infinity. The stairs below me shifted into a ramp, and my legs went out. I managed to catch myself and press my legs and arms against the opposing walls, preventing myself from sliding down. Below, the helmet rolled past the staircase, buzzing emanating from it. The buzzing stopped. In the shadows, I heard what sounded like hands on the cement floor, slapping skin, hitting the ground as they moved something forward. The child with the lower jaw came into view now, crouched down on all fours like a wild animal about to attack. The lower jaw hung only inches from the ground. The upper part of her face was alternating between the demented child and Jules.
My baby's hungry.
The words croaked out from the open cavern of her mouth. Then, she darted up the flat stairs towards me, still on all fours. Within seconds, she was atop of me, her jaw about to clamp down around my head. Then everything disappeared, and I was back in our apartment. I was on the floor of the bathroom, and Jules was performing CPR on me. I felt like my lungs had been used to run back-to-back marathons, and my heart had been in a painstaker. I was jittery and panicked, my eyes darting around the room, looking for predators. But none came. The first wave was over, and I barely made it through. It felt exactly like Rick had said, and with that, the frightening realization that Jules was likely going to have it now too. And with the baby in her belly. It couldn't have been more than a minute later when Jules keeled over, gently rubbing her temples. The migraine had started. I watched as the chills swept across her body, and then the fever. Then, for a moment, she seemed lucid and fine. She said she felt better. But then, she started to talk to someone in the corner of the room. It wasn't a language though. It sounded like she'd forgotten how to speak. Something similar had been happening over the last few weeks though. She'd called it pregnancy brain, and her mind would get foggy sometimes when she was trying to think of a word. This was different. This was gibberish. A frightened gibberish at that. Jules stood up in bed and screamed into the corner in fear. I tried to calm her down, but she jumped off the bed and ran into the hallway. I chased after her and found her in the kitchen. She was rifling through the utensils drawer and found a pair of scissors. She had the pointed end at her belly and was yelling at someone behind me. I froze, afraid to move and caused her to panic. She didn't seem to see me, so I moved in slowly, planning to somehow get the scissors from her hand. I was almost at her when her attention turned from over my shoulder to right in my eyes. She pulled the scissors away, raising them above her head and slashing at me with them. I managed to catch her wrist and twist it until she dropped the shears. I grabbed her other wrist and pulled her down, carefully, being mindful of the baby. I held Jules tight as she screamed against me, trying to get away. Slowly, her fighting eased. I felt her body go limp. Her breathing slowed. Then, she shuddered and came to. She was back, awake. Jules was trembling. Whatever she'd seen had shaken her to the core. I carried her to the couch, and we got as comfortable as we could. A scream from one of the apartments above us broke the momentary serenity. Then another scream, somewhere on the floors below. There was banging on the walls, the floors, and the ceiling. We could hear fighting, more screams, cries for help. They all slowly faded away, and silence returned. Time had passed quickly. I didn't realize it, but the first wave had been far longer than the hallucination I remembered. I tried to prepare myself for the next wave, wondering what the hell it was going to come after me with. After all, it had found my childhood fear of my parents' basement, the football helmet, and the moth inside it. I was only 8 when it happened, but it felt like a defining moment. I had been playing in my parents' basement when I stumbled upon my father's old high school football helmet. I slid it over my head and strapped it on. What I didn't know was there was a baby moth inside it. The tiny creature panicked and ended up flying into my ear. It crept further in as I thrashed about, trying to pull off the helmet, but the strap clip jammed. It was stuck on my head. I pulled and pulled, but it wasn't budging. And the whole time, all I could hear was the humming and attempted buzzing of the moth as it kept going deeper. My mom found me screaming and took me to the hospital. The little insect had buried in so deep, I had to get it surgically removed. The buzzing and humming haunted me for months. I had nightmares about the moth laying eggs in my brain. My parents kept telling me it was a baby and couldn't carry any eggs yet. But I didn't believe them. Thinking back on it, remembering the details made me more afraid of the virus and what it would find in my psyche. My memory raced through the minefield that was my past. Not just being a cop, which I had done for half a decade and had seen horrible things that became new fears, but all kinds of things from my teenage years, childhood. Jules nuzzled her head under my chin. For a second, I forgot about the world and enjoyed the moment. But like everything else, it couldn't last. I felt a lightning bolt of pain streak through the center of my head. I curled forward, rubbing my temples, knowing it was about to all start again. The chills crept in as the migraine eventually dissipated. The chills were colder this time. Somehow, I could see my own breath, like the air in my lung was frosted. But that quickly melted away as the fever was tacked in. It felt like I was sitting in a bonfire in the middle of the Sahara Desert, wearing 10 fur coats while pouring gasoline on myself. It lasted what felt like an hour. Then, it too was gone, and Jules helped me get from the cold shower back to the couch. Not a moment after I hit the couch, a lone scream pierced out from one of the floors below. It was from a child. I asked Jules if she heard it, but she disappeared. Only the distant echo of her voice remained. I wasn't in our apartment anymore. I was back in the junior high school. I was sitting in a classroom chair, one of the small ones with a tiny desk attached. I was surrounded by bodies, students, stacked high and formed into a tightly packed maze. It was a horrific sight. I realized I was the same age as these kids. 12, maybe 13. A tune whistled out from somewhere in the maze. Pop goes the weasel. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Then, another whistle joined in, but this one was from a different direction. They harmonized together. A low hum joined in. Buzzing. The only thing I could think of doing was the only thing I'd ever been taught about mazes, which was the wall follower rule. It was simple enough. If you put your right hand on the wall and walk, it will eventually lead you to the exit. I had to learn the hard way when I was a kid. I'd gotten lost in a corn maze at a Halloween fair in the country. It wasn't supposed to be for kids, but I'd wandered in and wasn't found for over an hour. I was terrified when they pulled me out. I thought there were things amongst the corn stalks. Creatures coming for me. The virus found that memory, that fear, and seized on it. I wouldn't put my hand on the wall of bodies, but I held it out close and started off through the maze. The whistling was further off now, but the two were sounding closer together, like they had found each other. I kept going. The maze pathway led me out of the class into a gymnasium. Smoke hung in the air, reeking of crowdite from the gunfire. There were bodies hanging from the rafters above. It was dark, but I could tell they were the teachers. Crying was coming from somewhere in the middle of the maze, my leg leading me towards it. Everything felt like it had that surreal, constantly forward-moving momentum that dreams always carry. Like whether you're walking or standing still, you're basically on a conveyor belt to wherever your subconscious is taking you next. My right hand was still stretched out to the wall of bodies, and tiny hands were brushing against it as I passed. The pathway grew narrower and taller as I got closer to the crying. I heard rustling above and looked up. The teachers were now lowering down from the rafters and into the maze with me. They were joining in with the whistling from the boys, causing a loud echo through the gym. I tried to pick up my pace, but I had no control over it. The whistling was overwhelming, and mixed in with it, I could hear the children's ringtones joining. Humming and buzzing came from the sides of the walls, and there was movement amongst the stacked up bodies. I turned a corner and found myself in a dead end. But I wasn't alone. There was a little girl there. I recognized her immediately. It was Jules. I'd seen pictures of her as a child. Not that I needed to identify her. She had that same face, just 15 years younger. She asked if I was here to save her. I said I was, but didn't know how to. She took my hand and told me just being there was enough. The whistling and ringtones got closer. Jules led me back down the path we just came. But there was now a fork in the lane, leading off to the left. The sounds were coming from the path to the right, so we went left. The maze led us out of the gymnasium and into a large room with an indoor pool. It was the Crestview Community Center. I remembered it from my childhood. I had taken swimming lessons here and nearly drowned. Before I could ask her why she took me here, young Jules grasped my hand tighter and pulled me over the edge. We were both fully submerged, her pulling me down to the bottom. But I managed to break free from her grip and swam to the surface. Then I saw them pouring in through the entrance. All the dead students and teachers surged into the pool. I tried to swim away, but the water was thick and my body felt like dead weight. I wasn't moving. Hands grasped every part of me as the body swarmed me, pulling me down into the now blood-filled pool. The last thing I saw before going under were the two shooters standing at the edge of the pool, laughing. Their hands were out in front of them, in the same handcuff me officer gesture. Dozens, hundreds of hands pulling me to the bottom of the pool, which I couldn't even see anymore. It felt like we were in the ocean. It was impossible to fight against. But I kept kicking and punching and thrashing against them. I kept thinking of Jules, back home on the couch, waiting for me to wake back up. Their grips became weaker as I continued to fight back. I felt myself getting closer to the surface, pushing through bodies and pulling away from their hands. Just as my breath was about to run out, I burst through the surface and shot up beside Jules on the couch, gasping for air. She was still under, trembling and with fresh vomit dripping from her mouth and chin down her chest. I wiped the vomit away and tried to clear her throat, but there were no obstructions. Her airways were open, breathing fast but unimpeded. I didn't know what to do. All I could think was to pull her close, hand in hand, and rub both over her belly. The trembling got worse, heavier. Jules felt like she was starting to seizure. Her head shook in violent jerks, and then she froze, hit back, mid-scream. Her chest was moving up and down from breaths. Jules gasped forward, nearly falling into the coffee table, but I caught her. Jules was awake. She was alive. We both were. And before she managed to catch her breath, she was sobbing, a terrible weep. I couldn't imagine what she'd just seen, being shown. She's a triage nurse after all, and had been one for longer than I'd been a cop. I only heard some of the more filtered stories, and they were absolute horror shows. But I didn't want to think about those. I wanted to clear my mind of anything the virus could use. We got up, rehydrated, and did a small cleanup, which felt necessary now and more a point of attempt at orderliness than anything. There were another 3 hours until dawn. We figured that meant the next wave was gonna hit soon, which also meant we'd be coming out of it to the sun rising. We didn't really have much time. We decided we didn't want to be found on the couch if we didn't make it. Jules put on her wedding dress, ripping the sides so they could fit over her pregnant belly. I put on the tux I wore. I moved the TV into the bedroom, and we put on a movie we both grew up watching, The Princess Bride. We laughed at the same jokes at the same times. We always did. It was our movie. I thought about last week, how difficult things had been, how afraid I was. It all felt so small now. I was making deals with any god that was listening to let us get through this, and I'd be grateful for every breath I took afterwards. And with that, the wedding scene started. Only the characters weren't in church. They were in the junior high school hallway. The audience members were the children and teachers wracked with bullet holes. The princess and Wesley were now the two shooters. A ground-shaking migraine, a frozen chill, and a scorching fever tore through my body at the same time, exploding in waves through my muscles. It was unbearable, like the virus has saved everything up to unleash on me at once. The TV began to expand, covering the entire wall and pushing towards us on the bed. Jules was beginning to seizure, blood streaming from her nose. I tried to grab her, but she sunk into the bed and disappeared. The TV screen absorbed the entire room, which was now the school hallway. I was alone now. Raindrops started falling. A massive storm cloud replaced the ceiling, now much higher than 20 feet above. Bolts of electricity fired through it, lighting up shadows of creatures inside, resembling large frightening insects. Moths. Buzzing overtook the thunder as the rain came down in sheets. I started to run, slipping and sliding along the blood and rain-slick tiling. The hallway was extending, and it was adding more doorways as it was. I saw horrific memories of all my old traumas coming back. They were monsters from comics I'd read and movies I'd seen as a kid. The old petrified tree in my neighbor's yard that I used to think would swoop down and grab me if I ever walked by it alone. Swarms of large insects and carnivorous moths. The virus had found them all. I felt like I was in a car, whipping past memories and fears. As I sprinted past the doors, they began spilling out behind me like some sick, twisted clown car full of nightmares. My terrors chased me, gaining in numbers with every door. I realized my whole life was one big fear. I felt everything behind me getting closer and larger as I was shrinking down to nothing. The hallway stopped expanding, and suddenly, the far end rushed back towards me. On the wall speeding ahead was a lone door I recognized. It was the office of our obstetrician and gynecologist. I didn't care. I rushed in and slammed the door. A red moonlight poured in from the windows. I could see Jules in the chair to the right, the one she always sat in. She wasn't pregnant, and had her face in her hands, bawling. But she wasn't alone. I was beside her, in the chair to the right. But it wasn't me. It was like a real-life mannequin version of me. Plasticky, shiny, almost waxy. I was grinning from ear to ear. An uncomfortable truth pulsed through me. One I kept locked away. Deep down, even from myself. But it was out now. In my biggest fear, revealed itself. I hadn't wanted Jules to give birth. There was a time when I did. A time I'd looked forward to it, fantasized about being dad. But now, I was different. I didn't think I could protect Jules or anyone else. I'd been growing pessimistic since before the shooting happened. But after it, all I could see was our kid in that school, blown apart for no reason by some maniac they didn't even know. The attack had all been so pointless. I guess that's why the shooters did it. To hurt everyone by hurting the most vulnerable. To hurt our futures. And they had made me question mine. It was worse than fear though. It had guilt twisted in through it. Because it was what Jules and I had wanted. And now, I felt I couldn't be anything other than a massive disappointment. A colossal failure. The wax figure's grin grew larger, and the smiling shooter's face flooded my mind. I could tell he enjoyed the feeling I had, and realized it was making him stronger. Every acceptance of it would make him larger, and me smaller. Jules screamed out and fell off the chair, clutching her belly. I ran to her side, trying to help. Her stomach was flat, but there was movement under the skin. Then, it ballooned outwards, like a rapid growth pregnancy. Jules was crying in pain as she went to full-term size in seconds. The outline of something rigid and bony was shifting under the skin as it expanded outwards. Jules stopped screaming and went limp. She was gone. But the movement inside her kept shifting. Then, he was humming. A buzzing from inside. A sharp proboscis pierced the skin and tore down the sides of Jules's belly. A second proboscis poked up, revealing the frightening face of a moth. Though, its mouth was filled with the sharp, jagged teeth of other larger creatures. The plastic version of me started laughing, bellowing out from behind me. It was the happiest it ever been. Anger burned through me. I grabbed the chair Jules had been sitting in and slammed it down on the moth. Jules' stomach caved inward as I rained down blows, turning the moth into a disgusting pulpy mess. As I destroyed the creature, I realized the anger driving me and flowing through my arms was because I did want the baby. I was scared I wouldn't stack up to the challenge, but I wanted to be her dad. I was reminded of all the positive daydreams I had of having a baby. A child with Jules, what we'd do together and how we'd learn and grow. The moth stopped moving. Everything went quiet. I looked down at Jules and felt air leave the room. My heart stopped and rose into my throat. We were back in our apartment. The sun had risen high in the sky now and filled the living room with light. I was standing over Jules, holding one of the stools from the kitchen. Jules' stomach was a horrifying sight. It was an open cavity now, the remnants of the pregnancy now destroyed from a vicious beating. From me. The bloody aftermath dripped from the stool in sickening plops. I dropped the stool, in a daze now, unbelieving of what I had done. I couldn't cry or think. I could barely breathe. I couldn't come to terms with what I committed, and my mind fractured into millions of acidic thorns. I felt like literal poison. Toxic. A breeze passed through the apartment, and I noticed the window open. It seemed to beckon me. I couldn't imagine carrying on after this. So, I walked towards the window and climbed up on the ledge. The town was calm. It didn't look like anyone else was awake yet. Or maybe I was it. Rick had said it was an 80% death rate. Maybe it was even more than that. Maybe I had been the only survivor. I didn't care. My world was different now, and I didn't want to live in it. I shifted on the ledge, leaning forward, and felt gravity taking over. Just as my hand left the window frame, a cold, clammy grip latched onto my wrist, pulling me back into the apartment. I landed on the ground and felt air fill my lungs like I hadn't breathed in hours. The light in the apartment changed. The soft glow of the morning sun was just passing between the buildings in the distance, filling the room with warmth. It was dawn, and Jules was standing over me. She was alive, though looked like she'd had one hell of a night. Her belly looked perfectly healthy and untouched. She bent down and hugged me. I realized I was awake now, really awake. There were no more fears or hallucinations. No more facing the past. We'd both made it. We cried together for what felt like an hour. 2 days later, the bolts were removed from our doors, and the hazmats arrived again. All surviving tenants of the building were now immune and clear to leave. Jules and I were the only ones. Jules was bombarded with pressure waves, and we were rushed to the hospital. We were examined, and she gave birth in quarantine to our beautiful, healthy daughter. In the weeks that followed, there was a change between us. The ground below our feet felt more stable. Everyday issues felt so small and easy to overcome. Jules and I had gone to war together and come back closer than before. I felt my courage and strength grow every day, and I know Jules did too. Whatever she experienced, she overcame it, same as I did. We still don't know what happened that weekend. We signed the NDAs and received a small sum of hush money. The mainstream media was feeding people talking points about a natural gas leak in the subway that caused hallucination and deaths. But we know that's not true. We know that something leaked out and destroyed most of our small town. And the government somehow contained and hid it. Hopefully, nothing like it ever leaks out again.